COVID virus. We are a group of psychologists who have gotten together to try to provide resources for other mental health professionals and other people who are affected by the coronavirus pandemic. And we are specializing in the area of interpersonal abuse and violence. But today we're going to be looking at some of the effects of the coronavirus on people who are getting a little bit older. Those of us, we consider ourselves the older population, but we're functioning. And you're going to hear about this group of people today from two of our very esteemed members on our task force. Let me introduce those of you who are on a Zoom call or on Facebook. You can see us. There are more who will be joining us from our group. You may have met Dr. Giselle Gavaria when she first started our Zoom call today. She is a psychologist from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we have Dr. Marilyn Saffer from Haifa, Israel. We're an international group, and she will be one of our presenters today. And we also have Dr. Irit Felsen from New York, a psychologist who works in independent practice in New York City. And we have Dr. Patricia Villavicencio Carrillo from Madrid, Spain. So you can see we're a very international group, and we try to make the tips that we give, the resources that we give on this weekly Thursday at noon Eastern time. We try to make them appropriate for all over the world, for people to adapt and use them the best that you can as we all survive a coronavirus pandemic and a virus that is indeed a big deal, no matter what anybody else tells you. This has been a big deal for all of us, and especially the psychological effects of having to live through such an unknown pandemic as we have been living through. And finally, the last person you can see on the Zoom call, I think we have some non-video participants as well who will jump in later, is Dr. Michaela Mendelssohn. She was our presenter last week, and she is going to be with us today. She is a psychologist in independent practice in Boston, but she's originally from South Africa, and she has lots to share with us internationally as well, as is Dr. Larry Gerstein, who has just joined us from the Peace Center in Indiana. So we've got a great group, and I know there'll be a few more who are going to be jumping on as well. The way we hold these roundtables, we try to make them as informal as possible so that people can ask questions, and we save time, a good portion of time for discussion, so that you don't just have to ask a question, you can also add some information, because the goal is to get as many tips and resources out to people who need them. And so if you're on Facebook, please type in your comments. We monitor the Facebook and we'll try to get to them as well. We do use the chat room. So you may type in, if you're on Zoom, you may type in your chat comments as well. So I think with that, I'm going to turn over to Marilyn Saffer, who's going to start us off with, I think, some tips on what it's like to grow older gracefully. So please take it away, Marilyn.
I must start by saying that I hadn't thought of myself as elderly. Started coming when they started talking about the over 80s and the dangerous age to be, because there aren't too many people over 80 that don't have some sort of accompanying or underlying medical disorders. A friend of mine has begun calling us the national treasures because we often are the first group that's been locked in here in Israel because of sort of being exposed to COVID. We're in the most dangerous situation. Um, I just like to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a clinical psychologist who specializes in gender and social psychology. And I've also been an activist since my early years in the United States. I was in the civil rights movement, spent some time in Mississippi before I left for Israel. And I left for Israel 52 years ago for feeling that the situation of women in Israel was better than the States, since women served in the army and women were out there politically, something that you didn't see in the States. I will tell you that one of the books that I edited was called Calling the Equality Bluff, Women in Israel. It certainly wasn't the situation. And from the earliest years that I was here, I was a founder of what we called then the new feminist, the new women's liberation movement that began in my university in 1970. And we became very active in dealing with violence towards women, making abortions available to women that, for one reason or other, could not forego their pregnancies and so forth. Um, I did a major study at my university of sexual harassment at the university. And as a result, an inter-university committee was formed to deal with sexual harassment at the universities. And with all of this activity, as I said, I didn't think of myself as getting older. I mean, I had more time when I retired to do some of these activities. And I am I, I'm physically active. I've been doing Pilates 3 times a week with a trainer individually. And that has been a problem for me during the times we're locked in, not being able to do this. Fortunately, I have a dog. And so during this period of time, you were allowed to go out for walks. In the beginning, it was only 100 meters from the house. But if you had a dog, you could walk farther. And my poor dog at some point got tired of going out of the house 4 or 5 times a day. She refused to go out. But, it's just dealing with some of these. I, I'll tell you what, when the first came out and we first started getting information, I would say that all the people that I know and many of my friends who are quite active, and the oldest in the group is, I think, 87, we all sort of became very anxious and stayed in the house and not going out, and people were volunteering, to do shopping and so forth. And after a while, I found that very confining, and I started going out and doing my own shopping, going at times when I thought the stores would be small, and I would get the N95 masks. We were wearing gloves and, washing and so forth. And to be honest with you, following all of the research and seeing what happens to people in my age group that are still affected by COVID and having to be intubated, I started thinking about my own medical treatment, what will be if I were not in a position to make a decision, because I decided that I was not undergoing intubation, having seen the results that 80% of people over 80 that were intubated died, and the 20% that survived had serious problems afterwards. And so I made a power of attorney for my son and a friend, And I sat with my doctor and made a list of the various types of medical treatments I would have, to the point where we would go to do not resuscitate. And I had done this before, but not as such a detailed way. I know a number of my friends don't want to think about that kind of thing. But since March, I have a couple of friends that have not left their houses. I mean, there are some people who are active and doing things, and they don't go out, and they shut in. I'm not sure what this does to one's mental health. Um, we're now with another shutdown, and it's quite interesting. It's an interaction with politics in some ways, like the United States. Our prime minister sort of enforced this particular shutdown as a means of cutting out demonstrations, because people were demonstrating, and in Tel Aviv in particular, they weren't maintaining social distance, although most of the demonstrators were wearing masks. The major problem here seems to be with the ultra-Orthodox communities, as they are in the United States, where people don't pay attention to wearing masks and maintaining social distance. We've been having discussions about books that we read on Zoom. I am active in the university faculty union. I was a representative before I retired, and now I'm a representative on the retirees union. And there are about 300 people, and I can tell you from being in touch with them, I mean, many of them are in their 80s, perhaps even more. We have a problem in developing contact with some of the people in the community. Not all of them are online, and even though, you know, you assume academics have some contact with email and so forth, and we're trying to figure out ways to make contact to see what people need. We're preparing a list of what is available to elderly people in the community. And just a personal note, and I'll end on that. One day I get a call from some young woman, and she says to me, "Hello, are you Marilyn?" And I said, "Yes." She said, I can't remember where she said she's from. She said, "How can we help you? What can I bring you?" And, you know, it was so funny because she had no idea. She made absolutely no attempt to see who I was, what I could do. And so I would like to suggest that when people do reach out, that you spend some time talking with the people you're contacting to see what the situation is before you start offering help. In the end, I sort of gave her some instructions on how to deal with the people she's turning to a bit differently, because my first reaction was almost to close the phone when she called. And I thought that wouldn't be the best way to go about things. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have later on about how one grows old and deals with these kinds of situations. So I guess that's it. You read?
We don't hear you.
I more or less have finished what I wanted to say at this point. If anybody has any questions or comments, and we'd be happy.
I think maybe we'll save the comments for the discussion afterwards, if that's okay, because I don't see anything in the chat box at the moment.
Okay.
And we'll move on to Dr. Irit Felsen, who's going to also discuss from different perspectives, I believe. Anxious to hear both of you today. given the fact that I'm approaching there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. You know, we're all somehow at some point going to approach it, and yet it seems to be the topic that that gets the least attention. Maybe because we don't like to think about the fact that we will all get there. So the task force purpose in general, the interdivisional task force came to be in order to identify potentially vulnerable populations and their needs during this particular time of COVID, which is really, I think the most used word over the last few months is the word unprecedented. This unprecedented pandemic and the confluence of crises that followed it, that made it only worse. And so from a very early on time, as Marilyn said, and we have really the honor of having Marilyn on my group. My group is the subgroup on older adults and caregivers. And I do need to specify that we focus only on older adults who are community dwelling and not on older adults in residential facilities and nursing homes, because I feel very strongly that, that it is very important to acknowledge the enormous variability within the older adult population, and that there is a very big difference between someone like my colleague Marilyn and someone who's in a nursing home or even in a residential facility. And so there's another group in the interdivisional task force that is focused on nursing homes and residential facilities. In our group, nonetheless, as Marilyn said, no matter how intellectually vibrant and physically well people are who are in their later years, the findings showed quite tragically very early on that people over 60, 65, according to the CDC data, were at higher risk for fatal complications should they contract the disease. So that meant that people over 65 really had to maintain much more stringent social distancing, even in the United States, where we weren't restricted to 100 meters from home, as it was in Israel for a while, as Marilyn said. We had greater flexibility, but if you were over 65, it was really important to maintain much more stringent social distancing. And it created, oh, that cat is like unbelievable, unbelievable. So it created a much greater isolation that was imposed on people age 65 and above in terms of not being able to connect with family, with friends, all of those issues. And then what we also began to see quite quickly from early studies related to COVID was the fact that social distancing and the sense of isolation that it brought on were quite clearly related to all kinds of adverse psychological effects in older adults, especially, you know, increase in post-traumatic symptoms, in depressive and anxiety symptoms in older adults. So, and that's very consistent with observations that we have from previous pandemics in times in other places. So it became very clear that it's very important to identify vulnerable older adults, those older adults that are particularly susceptible to feeling lonely and isolated in this time. And so as a daughter of survivors of the Holocaust and a trauma specialist, I have, and a Division 56 member, I have a particular interest in the effects of trauma on the lives of survivors, on the way that they experience things throughout their lives after the trauma, and on intergenerational transmission of trauma to the offspring of survivors. Now, as you see, I'm not 25 myself anymore, and I'm one of the younger children of survivors. So children of survivors of the Holocaust are also nearing their own aging now. And so what I was very interested in is, as we know, trauma is oftentimes associated with tremendous resiliencies in the survivors, but also with vulnerabilities that are often not at all something that interferes necessarily with their daily lives, but can become activated in the face of particular traumatic events or stressful conditions, especially situations or conditions that bear some kind of resemblance or are associated in some way with the trauma that they experienced. And so my colleague and friend Amit Shrira, a professor at Bar-Ilan University, has already completed a study that shows that Holocaust survivors have more vulnerabilities to COVID as they did to other life-threatening situations, such as the threat of nuclear annihilation, when there was a threat like that in Israel a couple of years ago. And so we adapted his questionnaire and we gave it to children of survivors. And in fact, I just completed writing the paper last night. We do see in children of survivors that those with parental PTSD have a much greater vulnerability to feeling loneliness, to feeling psychological distress, such as an increase in depressive and anxiety symptoms, and to PTSD themselves, even though, by the way, they don't have less social support. So it's really something about perceiving yourself as much more lonely, subjectively, and so that study was something that we did, and now I invited my group to participate in a study that will be similar, that will look at all kinds of older adults here in the United States, across the country, which will give us different aspects of the experience of COVID, because different places in this huge country had different experiences and different histories of trauma, and will allow us to see if people with different histories of trauma in this country have different experience during COVID, different needs, and how these groups compare to each other. We also are going to run a qualitative study that will look at colleagues of ours and contacts that we have in various types of organizations, such as Marilyn just mentioned, the retiree organization, or agencies that service older adults, that will ask them qualitatively, how did they continue to provide their services? What new needs did they identify in their consumers? And how did they adapt to this incredibly unprecedented situation, so that we can collect this data and make it available to other people, and make it possible for people to access these new and emerging ways of recognizing the new needs and delivery systems that have to be adapted, even before it becomes sort of part of the formal available knowledge in our field. We want to have it somehow quickly accessible and available to people across the world. I think I will just add one more thing, which personally, I have conducted groups, interactive kind of psychosocial educational groups for children of survivors online. By now, since the beginning of March, I met this way between 2,000 and 2,500 people. And I found that it was incredibly important and valuable to the participants, who are people, older adults with histories of intergenerational transmission of trauma. They felt particularly isolated because they were unable to share their relation to COVID, their associations, how much it associated with their trauma history. They felt unable to share it with people who don't have the same history of trauma. And that makes me feel that this type of groups of people who share the same legacy of a trauma are particularly important for older adults who are isolated physically and isolated psychologically because of these issues. And they need to have a place to get together and share and normalize and learn from each other during such times. Thank you so much. Can't hear you, Lenore.
I know, I just had to unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you for both of you. Fascinating, the interesting things that are going on and the important truths that we're learning. You know, some of the things that the pandemic has brought out have been so very helpful for us in providing services to people. I couldn't help but think, Irit, as you were talking about a time when I was consulting in Costa Rica with the domestic violence task force, and we were trying to set up battered women's shelters. This is a number of years ago, and there was an earthquake while I was there, and the re-traumatization of people who thought that they had resolved the abuse trauma that they had experienced. It brought it all back again. And yet they were able to heal much faster from the second one because they had some of the training, I suppose, and belief that things could settle themselves down and work out from the first one.
It's also very interesting because it became very obvious in, especially in those very, very many groups that that I had the opportunity to do with children of survivors in this time. It became very obvious that they have a lot of resiliencies that they directly and specifically associate with their parents' history and with growing up with survivor parents and knowing what they endured and how they came through, and also vulnerabilities. So people will say things like, and it's very consistent with what you said, you know, they would say something like, I know that it can be a lot worse. I know that my parents went through the Holocaust. I can certainly go through this. Or I can't talk to people who are not related to the Holocaust because I find that I'm so much less upset about it, or find it less difficult than other people. That was also part of it, but it was also part of the isolation of not being able to speak with other people. And on the other hand, some people felt more upset about it. But so you have the two sides. You have the hardening and the resiliency that comes with trauma, and the sensitization and the vulnerability alongside within the same people, within the same person.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why it's so important when we just look at those of us who are doing formal treatment, that in our treatment plans, we include the rebuilding of resiliency, because we know that trauma, each time you experience a trauma, you lose some resiliency. And so we need to formally rebuild it back again. And there are some new publications, certainly Donald Meichenbaum has published a lot of work on rebuilding resilience, and others have as well. So I think it's something that we really need to think about, especially for people who are going through multiple traumas. And it's not unusual to experience multiple traumas. So it's very important for us to keep that in mind. You know, and Marilyn, I also have to say, I thought about when you were talking about how people talk to you. I live in a high-rise condominium building with a number of people. It's not a formal retirement community, but a lot of the people are retired, and we're right on the beach. So it's a place where you're supposed to relax and enjoy yourself. And we do have a manager who manages the building and the services that are provided. And that manager has been sending us notes as if they're treating us as if we are children, that we can't make our own decisions. And we have just been an uprising about how we're being treated, because all of us here are capable. There may be a few people who have an aide, but most people do not. Most people are totally functioning and have resources to, fortunately, to be able to do things differently. But one day they take the chairs away from us at the pool. The next day they put them back when we complain. Then they tell us we can't go to the beach. Then they say we can go to the beach. Then they say we can use the facilities, and we can't use the facilities. It's been quite a battle here. You know, and it's not over yet, because we have a crazy governor who is in conflict with the mayors and the government in South Florida, which has many more problems than people in the rest of the state. So we'll see. Anybody else? Yeah. I think we can all unmute ourselves so that we can just...
Congratulations to both of you. I love your presentations.
Thank you.
Marilyn, yours, and talking about what you've been doing, and, you know, underlying how people should approach people like you, who's 100% functional and intellectually and physically. And I read your presentation also and your research, especially focusing on transgenerational trauma. And here in Spain, we had a civil war in the 30s, just before the Second World War. And most of the people that have died during these COVID times have been the ones that supported our social system. And we, people my age, and are very upset for this and a lack of support, and especially for the ones that lived in residential homes. But not only they've been affected by that, they have been affected also by the economical crisis, because younger people have lost their jobs before COVID and during COVID times also, and their pensions go through that, those members. So I think this is the moment to pay respect to our adults, and they've been through lots, and they have lots of resilience, and we have. I love your research, and research is political in a way, because shows data that that should be put on the table.
Exactly.
For changing
policies,
laws and resources, and make clear that this during COVID times, many of the resources that vulnerable people have had before COVID have been taken away.
Exactly.
And it's not in the public. So in a way that you can mention it. Also in health care, that if you have not a very risky health problem, they stop giving those treatments to many other, not only older adults.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think research is fundamental, and these kind of roundtables. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Exactly, Noah had talked about. I too live in a high-rise building, 20 floors, and one of the things that has been obvious to me, even though there are general agreements about wearing masks and social distance, there is a lot of mix-up on the sides of our administration. I think, obviously, when I see what's going on in the United States and the various countries, for example, uh, I cannot understand how someone will get into an elevator and not put on a mask. And the building has indicated that people can only go into the elevators wearing a mask. There should only be, we have elevators that 8 people can go into, and one elevator that I think 12 or 14 can go in. And so originally that one you could go in 2 and 1, and it got to be mixed up. So now only one person is supposed to go into the elevator. And I have had some arguments with people when they were allowing more than one in the elevator who wanted to get in without masks. And I'm saying, the elevator is the most dangerous place you can be in during this period of time.
Right.
And I cannot get a straight answer from the Ministry of Health whether it's better to leave the fan on in the elevator or to shut the fan off. I mean, logically, it seems to me you might be better keeping the fan off, because if there are particles in the air, they will eventually drop, since they're not getting fresh air circulated except when the elevator doors open. And so whenever I go in, I shut the fan off. But if, and I've asked the people that manage the building to get, and the Ministry of Health has not given any clear indication of what should be done. And I think that this is a real problem, that even when it's not on a political level like you're having in the United States, they don't seem to have their acts together, making decisions that would be appropriate for the different types of housing situations people live in.
Right.
I think that's so important, Marilyn. When that happened in my building, David and I, when we would go out, we would take a can of spray Lysol. And if anybody came near us, we sprayed the Lysol. People were so upset with us, but I didn't care. I thought, I'm just not going to deal with some of these people who I think are selfish. I mean, I think wearing a mask is the least we can do.
Right. The least we can do to protect each other.
Protect other people as well as ourselves. I had a book club meeting. We met outside, social distance, and if we're socially distanced sufficiently, I don't mind wearing, some people not wearing a mask outside. But one woman started a political rant, I would say. And David and I said, if she does that one more time, we're leaving. We're just going to get up and leave. And so, I think it's both causing the people. I swim every day because that's the exercise I can get, that I can, in weather permitting. And the people that are down there when we swim are wonderful. We have formed, many of them I didn't know before, because it's a very large building, but we formed a very nice group. So I think you both have the people that you can be friendly with, and we're all in it together, and you have the people that don't see it the same.
Well, I think this has always been a feature of stressful and traumatic times, right? They bring the best and the worst out of people. And we're seeing it again. And I think that from our perspective, from my perspective, in terms of the the studies and the groups that I ran, I think that what you mentioned, you know, the additional, as I said, confluence of crises that happen in the United States in the wake of COVID, you know, the political, the social, certainly add to the distress of people who are sensitized by previous political and social trauma that they went through. And I think it's very important for us to, as trauma psychologists, to do these studies and to document it, because it's very easy to ignore the effects of psychological trauma. Nobody sees it on you necessarily. If you're a functioning adult who did well in life post-trauma and looks like everybody else, then nobody sees your wounds.
Yes, that's so true. I think it's really important, though, to stress the fact that when you're in a vulnerable population, it doesn't matter what it is, even though we are older and we're aging as well, I think, as we can be aging, we are still aware that we are vulnerable, more vulnerable than younger people are. And so for us, it's really important that we not get into difficulties with people who are not respecting our vulnerability.
I also think that it is our responsibility. I think that as psychologists and as psychologists who are aging, it is our particular responsibility to somehow lead the way in how our professions treat the whole issue of aging and older people, that who, if not us, yes? And I think that it's therefore an incredibly important time that we're in to recognize that this COVID and social distancing and isolation and all of these problems that you're describing, how to protect highly active, you know, older adults who actually are also still an incredibly important human capital, right? We have a lot to offer. We have a lot to give. We can still do a lot of things, but we have to do it in a safe way. Yes. Safe for us. So this is an incredibly important time for us to recognize that COVID is here probably to stay a lot longer than we would like, and that the possibility of similar situations occurring in the future is very likely, and that we have to plan accordingly. Yes. We have to plan how to live, what policies, starting from the policy of a 20-story high building, all the way up to other policies about how we deliver services, what is going to be fined, what kind of behavior is going to be fined, enforced, how are organizations going to allow us to operate so that we can use and be the capital that we are without endangering ourselves. All of these things, that's our job to highlight right now.
I think that's so important, so important. You know, I think one of the things about our task force that has really been exciting for me is to watch the interaction between our younger members and our older members, and the gifts that we each bring to the task force that has been so well appreciated. Certainly our younger members who really are whizzes at the internet, and we would not be on Facebook Live and on Zoom if it weren't for our younger members who, within the very first meeting that we all got together, they said, come on, let's get on social media, you know, and those of us who were the, you know, older leaders saying, yeah, that would be a nice idea. And they said, no, right now we're going to do it. What name do we want? And, you know, before the end of the hour, Giselle and Brittany and Rita and Denise had us up and running. Yeah. So I think as older adults, we have a lot to learn from the wisdom and skills that our younger colleagues bring to us. And that's been a wonderful experience for us.
Absolutely. And I think it really was an eye-opening opportunity to change the traditional sort of hierarchical power structure in
Yes.
professional organizations between the older experienced, people and the younger inexperienced, so to speak, ones. That we have totally different skills and strengths to bring to each other is a very, I think, clear observation these days.
Yes, it is very clear. I hope an organization like APA, the large ones, are really going to take it under account, because they're large and very difficult to make changes. So I'm on APA Council, and I see it's not moving as fast as I'd like it to move. And that's, I think, another part of aging, is that when you start to deal with the fact that you have less time to get things done and less energy to move them faster, we're always having to look at prioritizing and refocusing where our energy is going to go. Something for me was a real learning experience, because I always, as I grew up, always had more energy to do anything. But that's not so anymore. So now I have to be much more careful about prioritizing. And taking on big organizations is not always the best way to use my time, because I have to poke at them a lot before they're going to really move.
Well, Don Quixote learned that lesson a long time ago.
I'm sorry?
Don Quixote learned that lesson a long time ago.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
I'd like to pick up again from what Lenore is saying, that if I think a major problem of the elder group, the 80 plus group, and maybe even some of the 70 plus group, even in the academic community, is not having the technological skills. I mean, where in various groups that we have support, intergenerational support, but many of these people that I'm trying to contact in our retirement group are not there. And it's not clear how we can help them develop the skills, especially now that you can't really go into people's homes to do it. I think that's something that the technocrats really have to think about, how to make it easier for people. I have a few friends that actually moved into
assisted living.
Assisted living, and when they were isolated, I mean, some of them have such poor vision that they're not able to telephone, and they're not able to work on the internet. And I mean, there are technological machines and apps and stuff that can help, but I don't know that there are people around that are worrying about this side. They seem to be more worrying about just the physical care and not the intellectual and stimulus that is necessary. And that, I think, is a real problem, because that allows, that sort of almost pushes people into a depressive situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I heard from people whose parents were, let's say, hard of hearing and were living in, especially the ones living in residential, not in nursing homes, but even just assisted living, and confined to their own little apartment or their own little room. And the people would say, my mother is hard of hearing. She can't even listen to the TV or anything like that. And I think that tells us that part of what we need to probably highlight and push somehow to the front of somebody's awareness is that when people go into assisted living situations or places like that, or live alone at home, and their hearing begins to go or their eyesight begins to go, that part of the normal sort of adjustment to old age needs to include installing the technology, as Marilyn says, in their home or in their room that amplifies. My mom had a thing that allowed her to listen to the TV even when their hearing got much worse. Have things for eyesight, and it needs to become something that is much more regularly assessed. The need for it needs to be much more regularly assessed and immediately installed for the possibility that the person will become completely isolated and really depend on it for their mental health survival.
I think that's really an important point. And I was thinking as you were talking about the impact of health disparities on people, that people who can afford to be able to have those kinds of equipment and enhancement equipment, and then people who really don't have medical insurance or don't have the ability to have it. After all, don't assisted living centers put bars in the bathrooms for all of the I think that's standard. I remember touring a place where they had a lot of the physical assistance that people might need as they get older because of balance issues, but they don't think about the mental health issues. And it's harder to get that resiliency back once you lose it. It takes a longer period of time. And so, Marilyn, I'm so glad that that beautiful dog that you have keeps you going out and walking. And
to me, it's always very striking that, people have been growing older for a very long time. Aging is not a new phenomenon. And yet there is such a resilience, such a resistance to making all of the possible adjustments that are possible in terms of the technologies that we have. And it's just an area that's neglected. Yes. And I think it's something that is really a problem of ageism, even within our own field, because as I mentioned in our conversation another time, Lenore, even the existence of this group within the task force was only because I pointed out, after all of the other groups of potentially vulnerable populations were created, that nobody thought of the older adults. That's amongst a whole group of psychologists.
Yes.
So it tells you something about how we don't want to think about this area, and we don't bring along the developments that exist to bear upon the needs of older adults.
Correct. I found when I retired from the university, I had fewer assistants than I could have gotten at the university. They have all of that equipment where you can enhance computers, you can enhance telephones, but in our own homes, we don't even think about it until we need it. Now we pay a computer expert to come in and enhance it, not for me, but for my husband, who has to teach. He's the same age as I am, and he has to teach 3 or 4 hours a day on the computer. So, and he's not as, I won't say I'm computer literate, because I'm sort of semi-literate, and I have Giselle who comes in and helps. But my husband has very little literacy. So we're constantly running into his office fixing something.
Yeah.
And interestingly, he just learned this week that one of the reasons why he's having trouble with his mouse is because his arthritic finger does not press in the right place.
There you go.
To get a special mouse. Now, there's special mouses, but who would know? that's what it was. And I mean, he spent a fortune on computer people who didn't know what was wrong with it. So, you know,
Yeah.
it's just simple things like that that we need to learn how to pay attention to.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much all for doing this and for inviting us to talk, me and Marilyn and I, to talk about our group and about our perspective.
And maybe we'll put together some tip sheets from this, because I think it's really important that we'll have this recording available on Facebook for everybody. And we just created a YouTube channel, and but it's going to take us some time, but we're going to translate our COVID IPV roundtables to YouTube.
A couple of them will be posted today.
Wow. See, that's
Great.
Giselle.
Great.
So we'll start addressing some of those, as well as hopefully putting some infomercial kind of images in regards to some of the topics that we've discussed throughout all these roundtables, which is pretty amazing. We started with 2 or 3, now we're expanding to 10.
Yeah. Next week, everybody, we're going to talk another one of those difficult topics, but one that has not avoided hitting every one of us. And that's, how do we deal with loss? We're losing people to the virus, to other natural causes, sometimes to not such natural causes. In our IVP group, we're dealing with the increase in murder suicides, in domestic violence cases, child abuse cases. So we've got some speakers lined up to help us talk about and discuss, what do we need? What is COVID teaching us that we need to get on with the psychological effects and helping people survive and thrive? Thank you. Oh, Reed, did you have something before we close?
I just wanted to add a small thing, which to the discussion next week, which I might not be able to attend, that in relation to loss, a lot of people are struggling with the fact that even when someone dies of natural causes these days, the whole process of the funeral, the inability to attend, to be with people, complicates so much the whole experience these days.
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about Shiva on Zoom, which has been
and funerals on Zoom.
Which some of us have gone through. So yes, indeed. I hope you can come, Reed. I hope everybody else online and all of our task force can attend. And oh my goodness, bye to our animals too.
Wow, what is that? Bye.